a small, tucked-away village where time seemed to stand still, life was a dance of quiet routines and whispered secrets. The village was cradled by rolling hills, with cobblestone streets winding through clusters of stone cottages that seemed to hum with the weight of generations. Each day unfolded in familiar rhythms. Villagers exchanged greetings at the market, mothers gathered herbs from the forest, and children ran barefoot through dusty lanes, their laughter mingling with the scent of fresh bread from the baker's oven. The air was thick with the aroma of home-cooked stews and the distant melodies of folk songs passed down for centuries. But beneath this tranquil surface, the village harboured more than its fair share of hidden stories. Stories that never seemed to see the light of day. At the heart of this village lived Elias, a man whose name was synonymous with quiet strength and reliability. Tall and broad-shouldered, he was the kind of person who carried the weight of the world on his back without ever complaining. He had a heart as generous as the open fields he worked every morning, and a resilience that had carried him through the toughest of years. Since the death of his wife, Elias had devoted himself to raising his two daughters, Mara and the younger, quieter Lila. Mara, bright-eyed and full of life, was his pride and joy, though in recent times the bond they once shared had begun to fray, weighed down by unspoken tensions. The source of much of this tension was Mara's best friend, Lena. Beautiful, carefree, and endlessly unpredictable, Lena had become a constant presence in their home. There was something about her, a wildness that both fascinated and unsettled Elias. Little did he know, the pull of the full moon was about to reveal a side of his life that he had never dared to confront, a secret that would shatter everything he thought he knew about loyalty, love, and family. The quiet of the village was shattered the night Mara's voice broke through the silence, sharp and full of disbelief. It was the night of the full moon, a time when the village was always a little on edge, as if the pull of the moon had a way of bringing out the hidden truths in people. Elias had always been an avid believer in keeping traditions, in following the old ways that had been passed down through generations. But that night, something inside him shifted, like a dam cracking open and spilling secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. Mara had come home late that evening, a frown tugging at her lips. The moon was rising, casting silver beams across the village, and Elias was sitting in his small study, reading an old book on crop rotation. The routine of life was as predictable as ever, yet something in the air felt different. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock on the door, soft but insistent. When Elias opened it, he was met with the startled gaze of his daughter, her face flushed with a mixture of anger and hurt. Behind her stood Lena, her usual playful demeanour replaced with a quiet tension. "What is it, Mara?" Elias asked, his voice gentle but confused. "Mara found out about you and Lena," Lila, his younger daughter, whispered from behind her sister, her wide eyes fixed on their father. The words hit Elias like a slap in the face. His mind raced, trying to piece together what had happened. You knew about this." Mara's voice wavered, her chest heaving with the weight of the betrayal she felt. Her best friend, the one who had practically been a sister to her, had been involved in a secret that her father had kept hidden for months, if not longer. Elias's stomach churned. His world, once so carefully constructed, felt like it was collapsing around him. He had never planned for this, never wanted this. The relationship he had with Lena was supposed to remain a quiet, personal part of his life, something he convinced himself was harmless. But now it was out in the open, and Mara's devastated gaze told him all he needed to know. I didn't mean for it to be this way," Elias stammered, but the words felt hollow. It wasn't just the fact that Mara knew, it was the way she looked at him now, as though he were a stranger. The trust they had shared was gone, replaced by something darker. She could never unsee what she had discovered. And then there was Lena, standing silently behind Mara, her expression unreadable. She was a part of this too. But was she truly a victim in all of this? Or was she playing a role in unravelling everything Elias had worked so hard to protect? In the distance, the moon hung heavy in the sky, its light turning the village into a landscape of shadows, mirroring the emotional turmoil Elias felt inside. The following days in the village were suffocating with silence. The air hung thick, heavy with the weight of what had been exposed. The truth, once unspoken, now gnawed at Elias's every step, and the shadows of his own home became increasingly oppressive. Every glance, every whispered word carried the bitter sting of betrayal, some spoken directly, others only felt in the quiet spaces between conversations. Mara barely spoke to him anymore. At breakfast, she would avoid his gaze, focusing intently on her food or out the window, as if the landscape outside could shield her from the storm inside. Elias tried to make conversation, but his words always seemed to fall flat, and the silence between them deepened, like a canyon that no bridge could cross. Lena's presence in their home, once a welcome familiarity, had become an unsettling tension. She still came around, but now there was an edge to her smiles, a calculated coolness that mirrored Elias's own unease. She would sit at the kitchen table, chatting with Lila as if nothing had changed, but Elias could see the way her eyes flickered to him, always slightly guarded. His heart sank. Was this what their secret had cost them? Trust? Friendship? Everything? The village too had begun to change. The whispers spread quickly. People who had once smiled warmly at Elias now cast furtive glances or looked away entirely when he walked by. His reputation had been his pride, but now it felt like a lie that everyone had finally uncovered. Even his old friends, who had shared mugs of ale with him after a long day's work, began to distance themselves, exchanging knowing glances whenever his name came up in conversation. The weight of judgment pressed down on him like a vice. The tension came to a head one afternoon when Elias was returning home from the fields. He spotted Mara standing near the well, her back turned to him, her face as pale as the moon. The last few weeks had hardened her, Elias noticed. She had become a stranger to him, and it tore at his soul to see the pain in her every movement. "Mara," he called gently, trying to bridge the distance between them. She didn't turn, but her voice, when it came, was sharp, brittle. "Don't, father, just don't." Elias stepped closer, trying to keep his voice steady. "I never wanted to hurt you. You have to understand." "I don't need to understand." She whirled around to face him, her eyes flashing with a mix of fury and despair. "You lied to me. You lied to us. And now you expect everything to be fine? To pretend it never happened?" Elias's chest tightened. His daughter's words cut deeper than he'd imagined they could. The rage he had felt on that first night of discovery now pooled in his stomach, but it was not anger at her. No, it was at himself, for letting things spiral, for being weak. "I never meant for it to go this far, Mara," he said quietly, his voice full of regret. "But I don't expect you to forgive me. I want you to understand that it was a mistake." "Stop!" Mara's voice broke. "You're not sorry for what you did. You're sorry you got caught." The words struck like a slap, and for the first time, Elias felt the full force of his daughter's anger. It stung, but it was the truth. He had been living in denial, thinking he could keep his secret buried forever. But now it was all out in the open, and there was no going back. Mara turned her back on him again, but this time, Elias didn't try to follow. Instead, he stood there, feeling the cool breeze against his face and wondering how he had let everything slip through his fingers. The following week, Elias tried to do what he always did, work harder. He threw himself into his tasks, ploughing the fields with more fervour than usual, fixing the roof of their cottage, chopping wood until his arms ached. It was how he had always dealt with problems, by making his body work as hard as his heart could bear. But no matter how much he laboured, he couldn't escape the tension that lurked just beneath the surface. The village gossips were relentless, and the moment Elias walked through town, he could hear the hush of voices and feel the cold stares that followed him. But it wasn't the villagers' judgments that cut him the most. It was his own family's. Lila, who had been his little shadow, now spent her days at her friend's house, always with Lena. He could hear them laughing and talking in the garden, But every time he stepped outside, the two girls fell silent, exchanging glances that Elias couldn't quite read. Even his younger daughter, so innocent and trusting, had been pulled into the web of gossip, her loyalty torn between her father and her sister. One afternoon, Elias sought refuge at the village tavern, a place he had once gone for camaraderie, but now felt like a den of judgment. As he entered, the room fell silent. Only old Bill, a retired fisherman with a penchant for gossip, dared to meet his eyes. "Elias," Bill said slowly, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "They talk. You know that, right? Can't hide from the truth forever." Elias stiffened. "I'm not hiding from anything, Bill. Just trying to survive." Old Bill studied him for a moment, then took a swig of his ale. "You know the village has got a way of remembering things, especially when it doesn't like what it sees." Elias didn't respond. He didn't have the energy to argue. Instead, he simply sat at the bar, nursing his drink, letting the hum of voices wash over him like a tide he couldn't control. The days dragged on, and though Elias tried to stay busy, he couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in around him. He wanted to fix things, to make amends, but with each passing day, the divide between him and his family seemed to grow wider, the rift too deep to repair. The real challenge came when Lena stopped coming to the house altogether. The absence was deafening. Mara refused to talk about her, but Elias saw the hurt in her eyes every time Lena's name was mentioned. Elias tried to reach out to Lena, to explain, but every time he approached her, she deflected him with a forced smile or an empty excuse. She had become as distant as Mara. "Why won't you talk to me?" he asked one evening, standing on the doorstep of her cottage. "You were my friend, Lena. I never meant for this to happen." Lena's eyes met his, but there was no warmth left in them. "It's too late for apologies, Elias. Some things can't be fixed. Some things can't be undone." She turned away without another word, and for the first time, Elias realized that he might have lost both his daughters, not to the village's gossip or anger, but to the truth he had hidden for so long. And now, all that remained was the cold, silent aftermath of his own mistakes. The night the storm hit was the night Elias hit rock bottom. It had been building for days, the oppressive silence at home, the cold shoulder from the village, the weight of his daughter's disappointment. But it wasn't until the storm came, thundering across the valley with a ferocity that seemed almost symbolic, that Elias realized just how much he had lost. He was out in the fields, repairing a broken fence before the weather turned. The wind whipped through the trees, howling like an animal, and the first heavy drops of rain splattered against his skin. His hands trembled as he worked, but not from the cold. No, it was the unbearable weight of everything crashing down around him. The fields, which had once been his pride, seemed to mock him now. His life, his choices, all laid out for him to see in the harsh light of this storm. It was then that the news came. Lena had left the village. Mara had come running to him, her face pale as she told him between gasps of breath. "She's gone, Father. She left in the night. No one knows where she's gone. She said it's because of you." The words cut deeper than any storm. Elias stood frozen, the cold rain soaking through his clothes. But it was the emptiness inside him that made him feel truly exposed. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. This was the consequence of his actions, wasn't it? The one person he had been closest to, the one who had once made him feel alive with possibility, had turned her back on him. And now his daughter, his own flesh and blood, was caught in the fallout. Mara's eyes, red-rimmed and filled with unspoken pain, met his. "You always said you loved us. But how could you love us when you didn't even love yourself enough to be honest with us?" Her words were sharp, each syllable like a blade against his skin. She didn't even wait for him to respond before she turned away, disappearing into the rain-soaked darkness. Elias felt the weight of her words sink into him like a stone dropped in water, sending ripples of despair through every corner of his mind. He had been so sure, so certain, that he could protect his family from the truth, that his love for them could somehow outweigh his mistakes. But now, in the cold fury of the storm, he realized just how far he had fallen. He didn't know how long he stood there, staring into the horizon, rain mixing with the bitter taste of failure on his lips. His heart felt hollow, an empty shell where the love he once carried for his daughters used to be. They were both gone, in their own ways. Mara with her unforgiving eyes, Lena with her absence, and there was nothing he could do to fix it. He had lost them, and he knew it. It was in that moment of utter isolation that a figure appeared from the shadows of the barn. Old Bill, the fisherman, who had often shared a quiet drink with Elias on the rare occasions they crossed paths. His weathered face, usually so stern, was softened by the concern in his eyes. "Got a minute, Elias?" Bill's voice was rough, but kind. Elias didn't answer immediately, but simply nodded, too exhausted to speak. Bill came closer, handing Elias a flask of something strong, the warmth of it seeping through Elias's frozen hands. He took a swig, the fire of the alcohol momentarily grounding him. "I know you're carrying a heavy load, lad," Bill said, his voice low. "But sometimes the weight of things can make you feel like you're drowning. Don't let it. You can still find a way back." Elias didn't know how to respond. His mind was a blur of confusion and self-loathing, but something about Bill's words, simple yet sincere, struck a chord in him. The old man had no illusions about Elias, no fantasies of a perfect life. He simply understood that sometimes even the heaviest burdens could be carried, if you had someone to help shoulder them. As the storm raged on, Elias stood there, lost in thought, and for the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to breathe. The path ahead was unclear, and the pain of his mistakes would not vanish overnight. But there, in the midst of the storm, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't in a long time. Hope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him wonder if he could still repair what was broken. Maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet, almost unnatural stillness that clung to the village. The air was thick with moisture, and the earth was soft underfoot, as if the world itself had been washed clean, waiting for something new to take root. Elias stood at the edge of the field, his eyes fixed on the horizon, where the sun, pale and uncertain, began to rise. The weight of the past few weeks had not lifted, but the spark of hope that Bill's words had kindled refused to flicker out. Something in him had shifted. The shame, the isolation, the fear, it was still there, but it no longer controlled him. The first step was always the hardest. He knew that now. He had spent so long hiding behind his mistakes, convinced that the world would reject him if he showed his true face. But no more. His mind was set. He had to face the people he had wronged, no matter the cost. Mara was the first to find him. She appeared at the edge of the field, her expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the distance between them vast, like the ocean. But then she stepped forward, and Elias's heart tightened, afraid of what would come next. "Father," Mara said, her voice quieter than it had been in weeks. I need to understand. I can't carry this anymore." Elias took a deep breath, every word a struggle, but he had no choice now but to speak the truth. "I made a mistake, Mara. I'm not proud of it. I've hurt you, and I've hurt Lena, and I've hurt myself. But I never meant to do any of it. I thought that if I kept the secret, everything would be fine. But I see now how wrong I was." Mara's gaze flickered with something. Anger, yes, but also something softer, a crack in the wall she had built around herself. "You thought that lying to us was protecting us?" she asked, her voice shaking. "That keeping secrets from me was better than the truth?" Elias nodded slowly. "I thought I was protecting you from the pain, but in the end, it was my own fear that kept me from being honest with you." There was a long pause, during which the weight of everything, the betrayal, the disappointment, the hurt, seemed to hang in the air between them. And then, just when Elias was sure the conversation would break him, Mara stepped closer, her eyes searching his face, perhaps for signs of a man she'd nearly lost. "I don't know if I can forgive you yet," she said quietly, "but I need you to know that I'm listening. And I want to understand, even if it's hard." A wave of relief washed over Elias, though it was tempered by the realization that forgiveness would take time. Still, it was a beginning, a sign that perhaps their fractured bond could be mended. Then, without warning, the door to the cottage creaked open behind them, and a voice called out, so unexpected that Elias's heart skipped a beat. "Elias, wait!" It was Lena. She had returned. Elias turned, stunned, as she stepped out into the open, her face a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. The rain had washed the bitterness from her face, and she looked almost vulnerable, like a part of her that had been buried deep was now emerging. "I'm sorry," Lena said softly, her voice carrying the weight of unspoken words. "I left because I didn't know how to fix things. I thought I had to leave, to forget. But I can't. I never stopped caring about you, about this family. I just didn't know how to be a part of it without hurting everyone." Elias's breath caught in his throat. He had expected rejection, anger, perhaps even hatred, but not this. Not Lena, coming back with open arms and an apology. The woman who had been the cause of so much pain now stood before him, offering a chance at healing, at reconciliation. "I don't know what comes next," Lena continued, her voice trembling, "but I'm here, and I'll stay, if you'll have me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Elias felt a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. Real hope. Not the fleeting kind that fades when the morning sun rises, but a solid, undeniable hope that things could change. That he could change. "I'll have you," he whispered, stepping toward her, his voice rough with emotion. The days that followed were not easy. There were difficult conversations, and still, the occasional glance from a neighbor or an old friend that reminded Elias of the mistakes he had made. But there was also something new, an undercurrent of understanding, of second chances, that began to slowly replace the judgment and silence. Lena returned to their home, not as a guilty secret, but as a member of the family. She made amends with Mara, though the road to rebuilding trust was slow, and there were still moments of tension, but there were also moments of quiet reconciliation. Mara would catch Lena's eye, and for a split second, a flicker of old affection would pass between them before the walls came up again. Elias, too, began to rebuild his relationship with Mara. They spent time together, working the fields, repairing the fence. At night, they sat together in the kitchen, eating dinner in silence. But it was a comfortable silence now. Mara didn't look at him with contempt anymore, and though her forgiveness was still tentative, Elias could feel the shift. In the end, the village didn't offer Elias the redemption he expected, but the people who mattered, his family, did. He had been tested, broken down by his own mistakes, and yet somehow he had come through it, and as the full moon rose again, casting its silver glow over the village, Elias knew that the storm might not be over, but it had passed, and in its wake, a new life had begun to take root, one built on honesty, forgiveness, and the quiet promise that no mistake was too big to be redeemed. In the months that followed, Elias's life began to slowly transform. Though the scars of the past remained, the healing had begun. The village, once a place of quiet judgment, softened around him. People who had turned away now nodded in passing, their stares less cold, and though the whispers still lingered, they were no longer the dominant sound in his life. Instead, there was laughter in his home again. A tentative but growing warmth that Elias had almost forgotten could exist. Mara, though still guarded, allowed herself to lean into the process of forgiveness. They worked side by side in the fields, rebuilding their trust, one task at a time. She didn't offer easy smiles, but the walls she had built around her heart were slowly crumbling. Every time she asked him a question, or they shared a quiet meal, Elias could see a flicker of the daughter he had once known, strong yet vulnerable. Lena too found her place again, not as a burden or a source of shame, but as a valued member of the family. She had come back, seeking redemption, and though it was a difficult road, she found her way into the hearts of both Mara and Elias. Her return was not without its challenges, but the trio, in their own time, learned how to move forward, healing together. As for the village, the gossip eventually lost its sting. Those who had once looked at Elias with disdain now saw a man who had weathered a storm and come out the other side, humbled but stronger. Bill, the old fisherman, had been right. Sometimes the weight of life could be unbearable, but when you found the strength to carry it, you could find peace again. The antagonists of his story, his own fears and secrets, were humbled. The truth had come out, and in the end, it was truth that set him free. Elias had learned that lies could only bind him for so long, but honesty and vulnerability were the keys to true connection. In the end, Elias's life was richer, not because the past had been erased, but because he had learned to live with it, to face it, and to make amends. His resilience had brought him back from the brink, and his kindness had started to rebuild what had once been broken. The lesson, simple yet profound, echoed in his heart every day. No mistake is too great to be redeemed, and no heart too lost to find its way home. Thank you for reading. He sleeps with his daughter's best friend every full moon. Elias's journey reminds us that no matter how heavy the burden of our mistakes, there is always room for redemption, growth, and healing. It's not the secrets we keep that define us, but how we face the truth when it's finally uncovered. The power of resilience, vulnerability, and forgiveness can transform even the most broken relationships into something new. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a moment in your life where you had to rebuild trust or confront a painful truth? How did you find the strength to move forward? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments below. I'd love to hear your reflections. If you enjoyed the story, please like, share, or comment, and let us know where you're reading from. Let's connect and continue the conversation. Life can be challenging, but together we can always find our way through.